We don't usually step into a story at the moment it tightens, but this one did not begin with a memory or a confession. It began with an object sliding across a table and everything around it going quiet. Avery Collins was already an adult by then, already a nurse, already planning a wedding. What caught our attention was not the demand itself, but how long it had been waiting to be made. This is how she remembers it. I noticed the sound first. Paper against wood. Slow. Deliberate. My father didn't look at me when he pushed it forward. "Read it," he said, his voice calm in the way people get when they've rehearsed something for years. The table was set the way it always was on Sundays. My mother's hands froze around her fork. My brother stared at his plate like it might disappear if he kept his eyes down. I picked up the paper. It was a consent form for a DNA test. His name was already signed. "I won't be attending your wedding." My father went on, "And I won't walk you down the aisle. Not until we settle this." My mother whispered his name, barely louder than the clink of china. He didn't turn. "You take the test," he continued. "We make the results public. If you're mine, I'll apologize. If not, then at least we stop pretending." I remember thinking how strange it was that he said pretending, like the last 30 years had been a performance we were all failing at. From the corner of the table, my grandmother's voice cut in, sharp and tired. "Thomas, this isn't truth. This is cruelty." He finally looked up then, straight at me. If there's nothing to hide, this should be easy. There was a pause there that hung longer than it should have. Even now, it's hard to say who was holding their breath. Sometimes the moment that changes, a family looks almost polite. If you're listening with us and this story is settling in quietly, staying for what follows matters more than reacting to what's already happened. That night didn't feel new. It felt finished, like the last page of something that had been written a long time ago, when I was 7. My father stood in the doorway of my bedroom holding a permission slip. I remember the smell of his aftershave because he'd just come home from work. "I'm not signing this," he said, tapping the paper once with his finger. "I don't put time or money into things that aren't mine." I didn't cry. I learned early that crying only made him colder. At 12, my brother Ryan came home with a new baseball glove. Real leather. He laid it on the counter like it was proof of something. Dad ruffled his hair and asked about practice. I stood there with my backpack still on, waiting for someone to notice. At 18, Ryan left for college. Tuition paid. Housing covered. Spending money transferred monthly like clockwork. When my acceptance letter came for nursing school, Dad didn't even open it. He looked at me over the rim of his coffee mug and said, "Your real father can handle that." So I handled it. Loans, double shifts, night classes. I learned how to keep going while pretending none of it hurt. The worst part wasn't the money. It was watching what those words did to my mother. Every argument circled back to me. Bills, vacations, Ryan's job. Somehow, I was always the evidence. After the dinner, Mom stood at the sink, running water long after the dishes were clean. "He's convinced," she murmured. "Once your father convinces himself of something, that's it." I leaned against the counter, holding the DNA form in my hand. It felt heavier than paper should. "I'm tired," I told her. "I'm tired of being the reason." She reached for my wrist, her grip shaking just a little. "You were never the reason," she said. My grandmother didn't call first. She just showed up the next morning with a canvas tote and that look on her face that meant she wasn't here for coffee. She set the bag on the table and didn't sit down. "Your father pushed too far this time," she said, fingers resting on the strap. I told myself I'd stay out of it. I can't anymore. I glanced toward the hallway, half expecting my dad's voice to cut in. The house was quiet. Dorothy reached into the bag and pulled out a thin folder, edges worn soft, hospital papers. Old ones. "I kept these," she continued, "not because I knew what they meant, because I was afraid of what might happen if I threw them away." My mother came in then, still in her robe. She froze when she saw the folder. "You never showed me those," she said. Dorothy nodded once. "I should have." "I didn't. Your husband was already looking for reasons back then. I didn't want to give him another." She slid one page toward me. A birth record. Time-stamped. 11:47. My mom's hand covered her mouth. "That's not right," she whispered. I was watching the clock. It was 11:58. The nurse joked about the date. Dorothy closed her eyes for a second. There was confusion that night. A young nurse. A supervisor who didn't want trouble. I asked questions. I was told to stop. The room went quiet again. She reached across the table and touched my hand. I didn't know the truth, but I knew something wasn't clean. I folded the paper back into the folder. My pulse was loud in my ears. For the first time, the form my father had slid across the table didn't feel like the beginning. It felt like permission. I didn't tell my father I was taking the test. As a registered nurse, I knew that a clinic chosen by Thomas Collins would be a clinic he controlled. I needed a lab that didn't know his name. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, sliding a mug toward me. "You're sure I've looked at our blood types for years?" "Daniel, they're compatible enough to pass a basic biology quiz, but not enough to quiet the noise in my head. I'm doing this on my terms." The lab I chose was a small, independent forensic facility across town. The technician handed me a clipboard. "Forensic grade," she noted. "We extract from almost anything." My sample was a simple buccal swab. My mother's was the same, though her hands shook so violently I had to help her. "You are my daughter," she whispered, her voice a fragile anchor, no matter what the sequence says. The third sample required precision. That Sunday, I watched my father leave his whiskey glass on the side table. I didn't reach for a towel. I handled it by the base, careful not to smudge the rim where his saliva and his DNA remained. I sealed it in a breathable paper bag to prevent degradation. "It's not court-ordered," the technician warned as she labeled the bag. "But the chain of custody starts here. It's solid. It's the only truth I'll ever need," I replied. As I walked out, my phone buzzed. "A text from Ryan Dad says you're dragging this out. Don't make it worse." I didn't reply. For the first time in 31 years, I wasn't afraid of what I'd find. I was only afraid of staying lost. The email didn't reach me first. It went to my father, fueled by a betrayal I should have seen coming. I found out at the hospital. My phone was vibrating against my hip, texts stacking up. Missed calls. A frantic message from my aunt. When I got home, Ryan was sitting on the edge of the couch, his face a mask of guilt. "He cornered me," Ryan blurted out. "He threatened to freeze the trust. Avery, he said if I didn't give him access to the lab portal, I was just as much of a liar as Mom." I didn't take off my shoes. I just watched his shaking hands. "And you gave it to him. I didn't send him the whole file," Ryan whispered, as if that made it better. I was panicked. I just took a screenshot of the summary page on my phone and sent it. I thought it would just end the fighting. My phone chimed. I opened the message. 47 recipients, including my future in-laws. The subject line was a vintage Thomas Collins finality. He wrote about his burden of doubt and the dignity of the truth. Attached was Ryan's screenshot. One line was circled in red 0%, probability of relationship with Thomas Collins. My mother called a second later, her voice sounding like glass breaking. "He's telling everyone. Avery. He says he finally has his victory." I opened my laptop and pulled up the full, multi-page PDF. I scrolled past to the line that had satisfied my father's ego. I read the very next sentence. 0% probability of relationship with Susan Collins. My father hadn't missed the truth because it was hidden. He had missed it because he stopped reading the moment he felt he had won. His certainty had made him careless, and his cruelty had made him blind. I looked at Ryan. "You thought he'd stop at being right about me. You didn't realize he was wrong about everything." My mother kept repeating the same detail, like if she said it enough times it would settle into place. "I remember the clock," she said, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cold mug. "I remember because the contractions were close together, and I was counting. 11:58. I watched it change. The hospital record said 11:47. I laid the papers out between us, the copy my grandmother had kept, the lab report, 2 truths that didn't touch." Dorothy stood near the window, arms crossed. "They took the baby to be bathed," she said quietly. "That part was normal. What wasn't normal was how long it took. The name came up later, after a few calls, a few doors that didn't open right away. Patricia Monroe answered on the 3rd try. Her voice sounded older than I expected. "I don't know why you're calling me," she said at first. "That was a long time ago. I'm not asking about memory." I told her, "I'm asking about records." There was a pause, breathing on the line. A trainee nurse mixed up 2 infants. Patricia finally said, "It was caught that night. We reported it upstairs. Then why didn't they fix it?" Another pause, longer this time. The administrator decided it would cause less harm to leave things as they were. She said, "Families had already bonded. They changed the paperwork, told us to sign, or lose our licenses." My mother's hand tightened around the mug. 11 minutes. Enough time to clean a baby. Enough time to rewrite a life. When the call ended, the house felt different. Quieter, like something had shifted and wasn't coming back. I waited 2 days before reaching out. Not because I didn't want answers, but because I didn't know how to offer them. Her reply came that evening. 1 line, "Careful. I think we should talk. Somewhere neutral." We met at a small cafe near the train station. She was already there, hands wrapped around a paper cup, staring out the window like she was waiting for permission to turn around. "You're Avery," she said when I walked up. Not a question. I nodded. "Thank you for coming." She took a breath, then let it out slowly. "I read your message 3 times. I didn't know what to feel." We sat in silence for a moment. The espresso machine hissed behind the counter. Someone laughed too loud near the door. My parents always joked the hospital mixed me up. Emily said, "I never thought it could actually be true." I slid the folder across the table, stopping halfway. "You don't have to look if you're not ready." She reached for it anyway. Her fingers shook, then steadied. "I don't want anything from them," she said after a while. "From Thomas. From the life I wasn't given." "That's not why I'm here," I said. "My mother's been blamed for 30 years. She deserves the truth out loud." Emily looked up then, really looked at me. "If I do this," she said quietly, "it's for her, not him." I nodded. That was enough. When we stood to leave, she paused, studying my face. "We both hold our cups the same way," she said. Almost surprised, I glanced down. She wasn't wrong. The historic venue was stifling. Relatives I hadn't seen in years avoided my eyes, their whispers dying down as Thomas entered. He looked triumphant, a man who had finally caught the world in a lie. He didn't wait for an introduction. He marched to the stage and snatched the microphone. "I'll keep this brief," he said, his voice amplified and cold. "Most of you received my email. I've spent 31 years being gaslit by this family, but science doesn't lie." He held up Ryan's screenshot. 0% match. That is the only truth that matters. The room was a vacuum of silence. Ryan looked like he wanted to sink into the floorboards. Before my father could bask in the judgment of the crowd, I stepped onto the platform. "You're right, Thomas. Science doesn't lie," I said, my voice steady over the speakers. "But you do. You lie by omission." I reached out and took the microphone from his stunned grip. I held up the original, multi-page document. "You stopped at the first page because it fed your ego. If you had flipped to the second, you'd see it also shows a 0% match with Susan Collins." A collective gasp rippled through the room. My mother's hand flew to her throat. "This isn't a story about an affair," I continued, pointing to the back of the room. "It's a story about a crime." Patricia Monroe stood up. She looked frail, but her presence was an anchor. "I was the head nurse at Riverside," she stated, her voice trembling but clear. "I signed an NDA 30 years ago under threat, but I won't take this secret to my grave. There was a switch. We told the administration, and they chose to protect their liability instead of your lives." Thomas backed away, his face turning a sickly gray. "This is a setup, a conspiracy." The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. Emily Carter walked in. She didn't need to speak. She had Thomas's jawline and Susan's eyes. It was like watching a ghost walk into the light. "I'm Emily," she said, her gaze bypassing Thomas entirely to find my mother. "I'm here for the woman who spent 30 years being punished for a mistake she didn't make." Thomas's knees finally gave out. He caught himself on the edge of the mahogany table, gasping for air as the world he had built on a foundation of suspicion crumbled into dust. No one moved to help him. For the first time, he wasn't the judge. He was just a man who had traded his family for a grudge. The house didn't feel lighter after the truth surfaced. It just felt empty. My parents separated within weeks, no shouting, just a hollow silence. Thomas left a note mentioning therapy, but I didn't respond. Forgiveness isn't a debt I owe. It's a bridge he has to build alone. The legal battle ended quietly. A $3. $6 million settlement for each family and a public apology from Riverside Medical Center. They called it restitution, but no check could buy back 3 decades of stolen peace. At the wedding, Susan walked me down the aisle. She held my arm with a fierce, trembling strength, finally free from the shadow of Thomas's doubt. He sat in the back row as a guest, not a patriarch, a condition he accepted without a word. Emily and I meet for coffee now. We don't talk about bloodlines. Instead, we notice the small things the clockwise way we both stir our sugar, and the identical faint, crescent-shaped birthmark we discovered on each other's mothers. I spent 31 years trying to prove I belonged. Now, I realize Avery Collins never needed a DNA match to be real. Belonging isn't about the blood you carry, it's about the people who choose you when the truth costs them everything,